Cameras once flashed, crowds once roared, and money once flowed through the doors of World Changers Church International like a river that seemed impossible to stop. But behind the polished sermons and global influence, something darker was building, something no one inside the ministry wanted to admit. And now, after years of whispers, warnings, and undeniable cracks forming in the foundation, the fall of Creflo Dollar's empire is no longer a rumor. It is a collapse unfolding in real time. What you are about to hear is a truth that many connected to WCCI hoped would never be spoken aloud. For decades, World Changers Church International stood as one of the most recognizable names in American megachurch culture. To many, it looked untouchable. A glittering sanctuary, millions in global partnerships, television broadcasts reaching every corner of the world, and a pastor whose name had become synonymous with prosperity itself. But as we pull back the curtain today, you will see a very different story. A story that insiders whispered about, former members hinted at, and critics tried to expose long before the public began to notice the smoke rising from inside the ministry. You're about to hear how a church that once promised hope, abundance, and transformation became the center of financial scrutiny, declining membership, leadership struggles, and internal fractures that no one expected to become this visible. You won't believe the hidden pressure points that were quietly destroying the ministry from within, and the shocking turning points that finally pushed WCCI to the edge. Because the truth is, this collapse didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making. It grew quietly, disguised under polished sermons, packed conferences, and the image of success. But as you'll soon discover, this is where the story begins to take a turn no one saw coming. Before the collapse, before the controversy, before the world began questioning what really happened behind the doors of World Changers Church International, there was a moment when Creflo Dollar looked unstoppable. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, he wasn't just building a church, he was creating an empire, one that blended spiritual authority with corporate polish, transforming WCCI into a powerhouse that millions admired and millions more feared to question. Back then, people spoke about Creflo Dollar the same way others spoke about major cultural figures. His sermons dominated television networks. His conferences were packed wall to wall. Families traveled across states just to experience the electric atmosphere inside the sanctuary. Every Sunday felt like a production. Every message felt crafted to elevate the brand, and every new building project felt like proof that God's favor was tied directly to expansion. But there was something else happening behind the scenes, something many early members now say was the first red flag. As the ministry grew, so did the expectations placed on the congregation. Giving wasn't just encouraged, it became a culture, a measurement, an unspoken requirement. The more the empire expanded, the more the message leaned toward financial obedience, sowing into leadership, and believing that wealth was not just a blessing, but a spiritual responsibility. At first, it didn't seem alarming. People were excited. People believed. The vision felt bigger than life. But growth at that scale is never simple. And every empire that shines brightest also casts the darkest shadow. Even in the early days, a few former staff members recall moments when cracks appeared behind the polished image. Cracks no one dared talk about publicly. Because the truth was this, the bigger WCCI became, the more pressure sat beneath the surface. Pressure that would eventually encourage decisions, behaviors, and financial practices that never fully added up. Pressure that turned a ministry into a machine that required constant feeding. Pressure that would one day play a major role in its downfall. And this is where the story shifts. Because while the rise was impressive, what came next exposed a very different side of the ministry, a side no one expected to see so clearly. But what happened next changed everything forever. The early 2000s brought a turning point that many inside WCCI remember vividly. The ministry was still growing, still shining, still projecting the image of unstoppable momentum. But beneath the surface, a quiet unrest had begun to rise. It started small, with murmurs from longtime members, odd financial decisions that didn't make sense, and concerns that were brushed off as attacks from the enemy. Yet each unanswered question grew louder, and each uncomfortable moment added weight to a foundation already starting to shift. For years, Creflo Dollar had preached a message centered on prosperity, abundance, and the power of financial faith. It wasn't unusual. Many large ministries use similar language. But what set WCCI apart was the scale, the expectation, the intensity with which giving was emphasized. Former members described moments when offerings felt less like worship and more like pressure, when monthly campaigns focused on goals rather than needs, and when the promise of material blessing overshadowed the deeper spiritual message people originally came for. Then came one of the ministry's most controversial moments, a moment that would follow Creflo Dollar for years, the push to acquire a luxury aircraft for ministry travel. To some supporters, this seemed reasonable for a global leader, but to critics, the optics were damaging. Suddenly, headlines questioned priorities. Detractors accused the ministry of extravagance. People who had quietly wondered about financial stewardship now spoke out more boldly. Inside the church, you could feel the tension shift. Leaders defended the decision, insisting it was for the gospel. Members who questioned it were often told they lacked faith or misunderstood the vision. But the damage had already begun. The outside world was watching with narrowed eyes, and the inside was filled with people asking themselves a question they were afraid to say out loud: what exactly is happening to world changers? This moment wasn't the collapse, but it was the first major crack that exposed how fragile the image of invincibility had become. Because once people begin to question the direction of a ministry, they also begin noticing everything else they had ignored for years. Attendance patterns shifted, financial commitments fluctuated, some longtime members quietly stepped away, and with every exit, the once thriving community felt just a little less unified, a little less unstoppable, and a little more vulnerable. But the real unraveling was still ahead, because what happened next wasn't triggered by money, image, or controversy alone. It came from inside the leadership itself, and when it hit, it shook the entire ministry in a way no one saw coming. As the public controversies grew louder, something far more dangerous was happening behind closed doors. For years, WCCI operated like a finely polished machine with a hierarchy that appeared unified, loyal, and deeply committed to the vision. But former staff members later revealed that the inside of the ministry was nothing like the calm, spiritual order projected on stage. Instead, it was filled with tension, fear, and an internal pressure that only intensified as cracks in the public image began to widen. Insiders recall moments when leadership meetings felt less like spiritual planning and more like damage control. Decisions were no longer rooted in community growth or spiritual impact. They were often shaped by optics, finances, and the need to maintain a public image that was already starting to fade. And when leaders operate from fear instead of clarity, instability becomes inevitable. But what truly shook the foundation was the growing divide between Creflo Dollar's inner circle and the rest of the ministry team. According to those who observed it closely, conversations shifted from how do we help people to how do we protect the brand. Staff members who asked questions were quietly sidelined. Some were transferred, silenced, or simply replaced. Others walked away on their own, feeling the environment had become more corporate than spiritual. Still, the silence from inside WCCI spoke louder than any public sermon ever could. Former employees describe a culture where speaking up felt dangerous, where transparency was rare, and where loyalty was expected even when things didn't make sense. This atmosphere created a new kind of pressure on Creflo Dollar, pressure to maintain control, to maintain relevance, and to maintain financial strength, even as the foundation shook beneath his feet. Tensions escalated when several long-respected leaders reportedly departed, some quietly, some abruptly. These were not minor roles. These were individuals who had shaped the church's structure for years, people with influence, people with insight. Their exits sent shockwaves through the congregation, raising questions no one on stage was willing to answer. And then came the moment no one expected, a leaked internal message, circulated only among select leaders, hinted at financial strain, declining membership, and long-term sustainability challenges. While it never reached the wider public, it spread quickly throughout the inner staff. For many who saw it, the truth was undeniable. WCCI was no longer what it used to be. Its growth had slowed, its influence had weakened, and its internal unity had fractured. This was the moment when loyal members began to feel something shifting. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it, an atmosphere that no longer radiated confidence or stability. Even the sermons changed. The energy on stage felt different. The once magnetic presence of Creflo Dollar appeared heavier, more guarded, and less certain. Members whispered about it in hallways, parking lots, and Bible study groups. Something was off, and everyone felt it. But this was only the internal storm. The external one, the one that pushed the ministry to its breaking point, was still approaching. And when it hit, it exposed a truth that even Creflo Dollar could no longer control. What happened next sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of World Changers Church International. If the internal tension was the quiet storm, the public unraveling became the thunder that finally caught everyone's attention. For years, the ministry had survived waves of criticism, financial questions, and the constant debate surrounding prosperity theology. But around the mid to late 2000s, something began to shift in a way that even the most loyal supporters could no longer overlook. The loudest alarm didn't come from the media. It came from the people who had once filled the sanctuary week after week. Longtime members noticed the change first. Attendance patterns began to dip. Younger families who once flocked to the ministry were slowly moving toward newer, more modern churches with different leadership styles. Critics argued that the culture of polished perfection no longer resonated with a generation seeking transparency over tradition. Then came the era of social media, a force that reshaped every major church in America. Clips from sermons were no longer confined to the sanctuary or television broadcasts. They were clipped, reposted, debated, and often misinterpreted online. What once existed inside a controlled environment was now open to global scrutiny, and the smallest misstep could ignite a viral firestorm. One of the most talked about moments was when Creflo Dollar publicly reversed his long-held stance on tithing, calling for believers to rethink the teachings he had championed for decades. Supporters called it growth. Critics called it a confession, and the internet called it a contradiction. Regardless of interpretation, the impact was undeniable. Some members felt confused, others felt betrayed, some felt validated. Suddenly, the foundation of the ministry's message was being questioned from all sides. With every new viral clip, every Twitter debate, every YouTube commentary, WCCI found itself thrust into the center of conversations it could no longer control. The ministry that once dictated its own narrative now found itself reacting instead of leading. The pressure intensified when well-known religious analysts and former insiders began offering their own commentary online, discussing shifts in the ministry's attendance, teaching direction, and long-term vision. They weren't accusing, they were simply observing. But the weight of their observations added fuel to a fire that had already started burning. And for the first time, the public began to ask a question that once seemed unthinkable. Is World Changers Church International losing its influence? Even supporters felt the tension. The atmosphere around the ministry no longer felt like the confident, forward-moving force it had once been. Some Sundays were vibrant, others felt noticeably quieter. The ministry was still functioning, still broadcasting, still preaching, still standing, but the energy had changed, the momentum had slowed, and the once undeniable dominance of WCCI in megachurch culture now felt uncertain. But the most shocking shift wasn't just in attendance, it was in perception. The aura of invincibility had cracked. The image of untouchable strength had softened. And for the first time in decades, critics, members, and observers all agreed on one thing. This was no longer the same ministry it used to be. Yet the most dramatic moment was still ahead. A moment that would redefine WCCI's legacy and force Creflo Dollar to confront something he had successfully avoided for years. Because what came next wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a headline, it wasn't even an accusation. It was something far more powerful, a shift that exposed the human side of a leader who had always stood behind the pulpit with absolute certainty. And when it happened, everything changed. By the time the world entered the early 2020s, everything about the megachurch landscape had changed. Congregations across America were shifting, adapting, shrinking, or reinventing themselves. But for World Changers Church International, this period became something far more significant. It became the moment when the polished image, the image that had carried the ministry for decades, began to collide with reality. This collision didn't happen through scandal or a sudden revelation. It came through something far more human, far more relatable, and far more difficult for any leader to navigate. A fundamental shift in the world that demanded transparency, adaptability, and vulnerability. For years, supporters admired Creflo Dollar for his confidence, his certainty, and his unwavering tone. Critics often accused him of being too polished, too corporate, too guarded. But now, both groups noticed something different. His sermons carried a heavier tone. His delivery slowed at times. His public presence became less frequent. And when he did speak, there was a weight behind his words that hinted at a leader carrying more than the public could see. Some viewers described it as maturity. Others saw it as exhaustion. Many simply sensed change. Even the ministry itself appeared to be shifting direction. As younger leaders stepped into more prominent roles, and as WCCI adapted its structure and outreach methods, longtime members began asking heartfelt questions. What does the future of this ministry look like? Will Creflo Dollar continue leading it the same way? Is this a new era or the end of one? These questions weren't born out of criticism. They were born out of concern, out of loyalty, out of a deep understanding that ministries built over decades eventually face crossroads that cannot be avoided. Financial analysts observing megachurch trends noted that post-pandemic attendance patterns across the nation had shifted dramatically. Online engagement became the new sanctuary. Older models of ministry struggled with the rapid cultural changes. Many churches, even the largest and most respected, faced declines, restructures, or full reinventions. WCCI was no exception. It wasn't collapsing, it wasn't vanishing, but it was undeniably changing. And change, for a ministry built on consistency and tradition, can feel like a kind of collapse. A collapse not of buildings or finances, but of identity. The ministry that once stood as a symbol of boldness and growth now faced the challenge of redefining itself in a world that no longer responded to the same formulas. During this period, whispers intensified around a question that both supporters and critics found themselves asking. Is Creflo Dollar preparing to step back? Nothing official was announced. No statement was released. But attendance shifts, leadership transitions, and the emotional tone of his messages made the question linger in the minds of many. Then came the moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter. A moment that supporters described as honest, unexpected, and deeply human. In a message that circulated widely online, Creflo Dollar spoke about personal reflection, spiritual reevaluation, and reevaluating teachings he once held tightly to. He didn't present it as weakness, he presented it as growth. But even so, his words landed like a quiet earthquake. Supporters were struck by his vulnerability. Critics latched onto it as evidence of inconsistency, and observers across the world paused, realizing they were witnessing a rare moment. The public softening of a leader known for ironclad confidence. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't a confession. It was a realization that the ministry, the message, and the man were all entering a different era. And with this shift came the question no one could avoid anymore. What happens to World Changers Church International when its defining voice begins to change? The ministry's future no longer seemed guaranteed. Its identity no longer seemed fixed, and its once unshakable influence now rested on uncertain ground. But the biggest turning point, the moment that truly redefined the legacy of WCCI, came when the world saw something they never expected to see from Creflo Dollar. A moment of complete openness. A moment where he confronted not the public, but himself.